Okay, so let's finish up talking about social identity theory. So we left off on talking about what was another big problem with creating outgroups. Really, the uh, probably the worst thing that you can possibly do once you create outgroups is that they eventually become scapegoats, right? You scapegoat them, and so you blame outgroups for, any sort of social ill. So this you've seen this a lot in the history of the United States. Again, going back to the example of the Irish, right, where we blame the Irish Catholics, right, for the demise or the potential demise of the country. Um, the Nazis did it with Jewish people in Germany. This idea of scapegoating, blaming them for losing World War II. We often see this here in this country where we scapegoat other groups, especially Latinos, because really Latino is not necessarily a different race, but we racialize them. Um, and so, for instance, the idea of immigration is sort of a hot button issue, still remains a hot button issue in the United States. And so, anytime there is, let's say, economic trouble in our country, we tend to blame others, right? In this case, Latinos, for instance, is because the immigrants are taking our jobs, for example. So that, again, scapegoat is a big problem with creating outgroups. So here's a really cool experiment, again, talking about good old Jane Elliott. And she does this really cool experiment. This is just a really brief snippet of what she did for Oprah. Of course, she is famous for the brown eye, blue eye experiment that she did with little kids in Iowa. And she has done this experiment all over the world with various degrees of success. So please watch her YouTube video that I posted onto Canvas. It's going to be on your exam. So let's check this out.
Today's audience was separated into two groups. Not on the color of their skin were they separated when they arrive. They were separated based on the color of their eyes. But they have no idea that they were separated. What we did was treat each group differently, discriminating against the people who have blue eyes, catering to those people with brown eyes.
Come on. What color your eyes? Blue? Over there. Put it on. No. Over there. Blue? Over there.
The blue-eyed people were pulled out of line, told to put on a green collar and wait outside. When the brown-eyed people arrived, they were told to step to the front of the line. Audience members with brown eyes were allowed to enjoy coffee and donuts. The blue-eyed group became upset when they saw the brown-eyed people were being seated first.
Look at those people went here. What are they doing in there? That's why they don't wait.
Diversity expert Jane Elliott helped set up the experiment.
I've been a teacher for 25 years in the public, private, and parochial schools in this country, and I have seen what brown-eyed people have done as compared to what blue-eyed people do. And it's perfectly obvious. And if I didn't believe it before this morning, you should have been here this morning when we brought these people in here.
Feeling discriminated against, the blue-eyed audience members were visibly upset.
She was rude to us, all of us. Yelled at us, called us names, pushed us aside. She was rude.
Just want to say, why doesn't Jane have a green collar on? She's got blue eyes.
Because I've learned to act brown-eyed. I have a brown-eyed husband and 3 brown-eyed children.
Why did you?
And the message in this room is act brown-eyed and you too can take off your collar. Act intelligently and you too won't lose your collar. None of you have acted intelligently yet.
It wasn't long before the brown-eyed people bought into the idea that they were superior.
You people, look, it is... People, I had a girlfriend in school who was blue-eyed. She was so stupid. She was always copying off of my papers. These people were so rude and so noisy today, we couldn't hear ourselves even talk. It was ridiculous.
Eventually, the audience figured out the show was really about race. Now, he was so angry, he took off his collar way on early.
How many of you people of color can take off the collar that we have put on you? How many of you can take off your color? But if a black male refused to follow your orders or your husband's orders or your father's orders on the street, you would not see that as being highly principled. You would see him as being an uppity nigger.
Well, we can see where this is going. She's saying that everybody has racism in them. It's not really about the eye. She's trying to teach about racism. But she can't get away from the fact that God created the races, and you are going to be different. You can't help it.
God
to be like
created
that.
one race, the human race, and human beings created racism.
We caught up with the mastermind behind the eye color test. Jane Elliott is her name, 22 years later.
So that's a really cool experiment. Again, the whole idea of brown eye, blue eye, just to kind of give you an idea of how we go about discriminating within our own groups, right? So imagine what we do to other groups. That's far worse than just discriminating on people based off of the color of their eyes. So moving on to Edward Said and his theory of Orientalism. And so it's a really cool theory. So he basically coined or helped develop the theory post-colonial theory. Basically, post-colonial theory means studies how and why colonized countries developed the way they did in the post-colonial era. So again, it studies how and why colonized countries developed the way they did in the post-colonial era. And so you have to bear in mind here when I talk about this, right? Think about the narratives that are constructed by the colonizers about the colonized, right? And so basically this theory, right, one aspect, just focusing on the media part, is just trying to examine how and why, right, various countries that have been colonized have basically struggled after the colonizer has left. And some would say that, the colonized mentality continues. And part of that has to do with the narrative that is started by the colonizers, right? What kinds of stories are being told about the colonized? And so Orientalism focuses on how the West, right? And when I talk about the West, I'm referring to the United States, but I'm also referring to European countries, Western Europe. And so basically it's how the West has an awful portrayal, has provided an awful portrayal of places like Africa, especially North Africa, a negative portrayal of Asia, and a negative portrayal of the Middle East. So again, it's basically the West's awful portrayal of Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. And essentially, right, Orientalism is sort of a critique on this awful portrayal of these different parts of the world. And it's one of the things that Edward Said talks about, is that the West, right, has created this narrative about these places. And so it's portrayed as uncivilized, it's portrayed as violent, fanatical, static. So this idea of static, right, or timeless, in other words, these places are underdeveloped or have never developed, right? And so they remain the same after all these centuries, which essentially, right, they place the East or this place of the world in a direct contrast to the West, right? The West is more civilized, or a lot more civilized. It's not violent, it's not fanatical, and it's dynamic, right? It's progressing. And so, which is contrary to how it's portrayed, how the East or the Orient is portrayed. So really you need to just think about, right? Just think about the various stereotypes that have been created about, the Middle East, about Asia, about North Africa, and I'm talking primarily like Libya and Egypt. And so think about the stereotypes that when we think about, right, these places in the world, think about, we think about its places like the desert. We think of it as just all desert, for instance, which is not, but that's the way we think about it. For example, we think about its peoples like evil dictators, or we think about the idea of terrorists, right, or belly dancers, or these sorts of things. So we create these that we create these stereotypes about these places and about the people. And so what Edward Said is talking about here is that, you know, these stereotypes, going back to the theory of stereotyping, right? It's mostly fiction, right? It is more fiction than it is real. But because these narratives have been told over and over again, it has distorted our perception about this part of the world. And so, for example,
what's Islamic extremism? Allahu Akbar. God is great.
Hollywood has a very narrow view of Arabs. I mean, just think of every Arab character you've ever seen on screen. Think of how those characters are usually inherently connected to violence and US national security, and then ask yourself this question.
When have you seen a Hollywood film tell the story of an Iraqi during the Iraq War? You know any cases?
Dr. Maytha Al-Hassan, a Syrian-American journalist and scholar, asked me this question when I was researching this story. And even though I had spent the past week finding every possible film related to the portrayal of Arabs on screen, I had literally never come across a movie like the one Al-Hassan asked about.
And then what do you have after 9/11? You have films like Zero Dark 30, Hurt Locker, what else? So that whole terror genre is told from the story of the military, right?
Al-Hassan explains this in her detailed report, Hawk and Hollywood, a look at the industry's decades-long history of stereotyping, whitewashing, and overall misrepresenting Arab and Muslim communities. Those misrepresentations are deeply motivated by US politics and literally influenced by the Department of Defense.
The tight relationship between the Department of Defense and Hollywood has been going on for a while.
A University of Bath investigation found that more than 800 feature films and 1,100 TV shows from 1911 to 2017 received support from the U.S. Department of Defense, which has its own entertainment liaisons. Mark Harris, the author of a book on Hollywood's partnership with the military, told The Outline, "The most that happens is favor trading. You get access to military equipment in return for a favorable portrayal." Even the CIA has its own entertainment liaisons. Propaganda researcher Matthew Alford said the agency's influence on movies like Zero Dark 30 and The Recruit has inflated real-world threats and dampened down government malfeasance. Al-Hassan says the film American Sniper is especially damaging to viewers' understandings of the Iraqi people and the U.S. military's role in their country. It was the top-grossing domestic movie in 2014, and it was nominated for the 2015 Oscar for Best Picture.
And then you have TV shows that try to recreate this genre over and over again, this 24, this Homeland genre.
In an attempt to flip the narrative, shows about U.S. national security and quote-unquote patriotism started featuring more Arab and Muslim characters, as long as those characters were willing to sacrifice themselves for American militarism.
Don't hurt her. You hear me? I'm coming out.
Al-Hassan calls this the good Muslim trope.
You, as a Muslim, have to be willing to die for this country, to sacrifice your life or to sacrifice your children's lives, to be accepted here. Within this good Muslim, bad Muslim framework, the good Muslim was also the one that the Democratic Party ran with at the DNC convening in 2016 at the convention.
After the 2016.
So it kind of gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. This video is a really good example. And so really what the argument is, right, is this idea that the media has helped create these narratives along with sort of echoing government policy. And so because of these two things sort of working together, it's sort of resulted in US and European imperialism, right? This idea, anytime you can sort of dehumanize a group of people, or you can sort of portray them as they're sort of being uncivilized or undeveloped, it sort of makes it a little bit easier to go ahead and invade those those countries, right? And so one of the things that's happened as a result is that it's enabled with the United States, and it's enabled European countries to essentially um, sort of, take over these countries for a period of time, and then exploit these countries. In other words, take out like important minerals or those sorts of things to essentially exploit that part of the world. And one of the things that sort of Edward Said talks about, which is pretty controversial, is this idea that the academy, right, us as academics have also played a role in this as well, in terms of we're also sort of echoing the the stereotypes or the policies of our government. And so because we as academics are sort of like reinforcing this government policy, we're kind of playing a role in this, right? This idea that because we're teaching you a certain way to think about this part of the world in a certain way, we're sort of enabling um, our government or supporting our government in their acts, um, towards this part of the world or the Orient. So that's an interesting sort of take on this theory, which I can't honestly contest. I think it's a pretty accurate argument. So how do you change this, right? And so one of the biggest challenges that Edward Said talks about in his book, in terms of like, well, how do we change these narratives and how do we change this perception, is first and foremost, right? We have to acknowledge these huge challenges, and one of them is the fact that the North Africa, the Middle East, and um, Asia are essentially off the grid. In other words, they're not in these cities that generate a lot of media content, right? And so because they're sort of off the beaten path of sorts, it's difficult for them to produce their own media content that's going to contest the dominant narratives that are already out there about this part of the world. And so that's an immense challenge moving forward. Also, he talks about the importance of this idea of being collaborative, or this idea of participatory. So one of the things, right, that's happened was that the people who actually lived in this part of the world didn't collaborate or didn't participate in telling these narratives. And so this is lacking. And so in essence, this is sort of has to change, right? There has to be more people from this part of the world telling stories about this part of the world. And so that's one way to sort of debunk these stereotypes. And sort of going back to what Bill Hooks talked about the oppositional gaze, is that we need to start as as citizens of this society, we need to start sort of contesting these traditional narratives that are being told to us by the media, right? We need to be, again, more active in contesting these narratives. So critical race theory. Which I sort of talked about just a tiny bit with Bell Hooks. And so it begins with the idea, right, with race and racism, and acknowledges that it is connected with the subordination and the repression of others, right? So again, it acknowledges, right, the fact that race plays a factor in subordination and repression. And so it's not separate necessarily from other things like misogyny or class. It doesn't, it takes those, it's not separate from that. It sort of takes those into account as well. So if you think about it just from the entertainment or media perspective, right? So, or sports as well, I guess that's part of entertainment. But it explores and examines how racism in our society privileges whiteness at the disadvantage of others. And we'll talk about this in more detail. But for example, the idea of the production code. So the production code, essentially, what it did was that race became a big deal during the production code. It essentially, prior to the code, it was actually much more diverse in terms of who were the heroes. But after the code, it sort of crystallized who are going to be the heroes, who are going to be the heroines and stories. And so the code really privileged whiteness, and it really hurt actors that were non-white. And if you think about the racial makeup of the Academy, the Hollywood Academy, it's mostly historically been white male. There's been a big push to try to change the racial makeup and also the gender and diversity makeup of the Academy. It's progressing, but slowly. And then also the idea of racial bias in sports, and I'll get to that in talking about Black quarterbacks, but also coaches as well. And so anyways, what critical race theory does, it challenges the notion of meritocracy, this idea that you earn your place in society through simply hard work, right? And so critical race theory what says that's not necessarily true, because if you're born of a different race, for instance, things are going to be a little tougher for you, right? And obviously that depends to some extent, right? What industry we are talking about, and what is the career that you're actually trying to pursue. But for the most part, right, color does play somewhat of a role in some of the things that we're going to talk about, especially when we talk about entertainment and media and those sorts of things. And also challenges the concept of color blindness, this idea that people don't look at color, don't think about color, those sorts of things. It also does contest things that were objective, right, which is not true. The whole notion of being objective has sort of been debunked, because we're all subjective to a certain extent. And it also debunks the idea that we all have equal opportunity. We don't all have equal opportunity or equal access to things. We just don't. And so it understands that these concepts may not exist for some people because of the race, right? So this idea that critical race theory talks about is this idea that, there are some white folks who may never experience this sort of thing. And they refer to it as sort of white privilege, but or maybe because they themselves are racist, right? And so that's an interesting topic to think about. But some of you will be lucky enough, maybe, to never really have to experience what it's like to be another, right? This idea of being somebody holding something against you because of your race. And so that's, again, interesting. So what critical race theory does is it essentially critiques institutions, right? Now, critical race theory started with law, right? It started with the courts, and basically talking about the fact that the courts were racially biased in terms of convictions, in terms of like sentencing of certain criminals. Of a white person or a black person committed the same crime, oftentimes the person of color, right, would end up having to spend more time in prison. And so it essentially critiqued the industry, and this theory has sort of bled over a little bit into sports or into entertainment or into media. And so again, it critiques institutions that have racially discriminated against minorities through institutional discrimination, and it attempts to address these issues. And so by understanding critical race theory, they believe that, essentially, if you have a knowledge of critical race theory, you can take steps into sort of diminishing the power of racism within these institutions. And so two things that it acknowledges is the exclusion and the marginalization of non-white people. And so one thing that it does support is this idea of telling stories from a minority or a diversity perspective or diverse perspective. So drilling down to this idea of critical race theory, we'll talk about a little bit about some examples of what I mean, what I'm talking about here. So going back to the idea of the production code and how it sort of marginalized the other, and it's actually helped support or it's benefited whiteness. So this is Louis Rainier over here, and she actually ends up winning an Oscar for this movie called The Good Earth. And this is Anna May Wong, one of the best Asian American actresses in the history of Hollywood. And so when it went down to casting this particular movie, Anna May Wong thought she was going to get the role because it's The Good Earth. It centers around, if I recall correctly, it's a story about a Chinese couple. And so she thought she was going to get the role. But because I can't remember who the producer was anymore, but because the producers could not find a good Asian American character to play the love interest, they ended up having to cast a white man, Paul. Paul, I can't remember his name. Paul will come to me. But anyways, he was a Caucasian male, Paul. I can't remember his last name. And because of the casting of this particular character who was not Asian, and there couldn't be any miscegenation on screen, Paul Muni, his name was Paul Muni. And because they hired Paul Muni as the lead actor, and they couldn't have miscegenation on screen, then you couldn't have an Asian character having a successful relationship with a white man, even though that white man was going to be, in this case, yellow faced, right? Looked like an Asian, but they couldn't do the casting, and so therefore Louis Rainier ends up getting the role over Anna May Wong, and Louis Rainier actually wins an Oscar for this role. But if there was such thing as a meritocracy or those sorts of things, or if you really believe in the idea of casting authenticity, then she should have gotten the role, but she didn't. And so this is one example where the production code, of many examples, mind you, where the production code works against Anna May Wong. And here we have another example. We have Hell to Eternity. It's a movie starring Jeffrey Hunter. Now, the movie itself is based off of a story by Guy Galbadon. Guy Galbadon, as you can see right over here, is a Mexican guy. And he essentially, what ends up happening, he has, I can't remember exactly if he was, if he lived with a Japanese couple, or if he was, or if he, this Japanese lady babysat him. Regardless, he was able to learn Japanese as a child, and so we go off to war. We're in the midst of World War II, and Guy, because he knows Japanese, is able to talk to these Japanese soldiers, and he's able to convince them that they are surrounded. And so essentially Guy Galbadon single-handedly captures, I don't know, about 100 or maybe more Japanese soldiers. And so I think he has the record for single-handedly capturing more enemy soldiers than anybody else in the history of the US military, if I'm not mistaken. But anyways, when it came time to tell this story about a Latino hero, well, they didn't cast a Latino to play Guy. They ended up casting Jeffrey Hunter to play Latino. And this had more to do with probably box office considerations and those sorts of things. But it sort of does continue the idea of having white male heroes in this case. And again, this movie was done again during the Code. So another example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Eric Bieniemy here. So as some of you know, I went to school with Eric Bieniemy, elementary school and junior high. We didn't go to the same high school because he was too good of a football player. Our high school was terrible at football. And so there's really no reason for him to go play high school football at our school because we were awful. And so we went to go play at a different school. The school that he played for was Bishop Ammont. I don't know if anybody ever heard of Bishop Ammont. But anyways, as you can see here, right, he goes to Bishop Ammont. He goes to the University of Colorado. He ends up being a pro player. I think he played for the Chargers, and so he had a short NFL career, and he becomes a coach. And now he is a coach for the Kansas City Chiefs, as you can see here, and he is the offensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs. And so basically, he's the mastermind behind one of the best offenses in the history of the NFL. So, as a matter of fact, they won a Super Bowl last year, and they lost in the Super Bowl this year. So anyways, he has been up for several jobs, and he has not been hired for any of these positions. And some people point to the fact that he should be hired as a head coach, and he deserves to be hired as a head coach. And there's some thought that he has not been hired as a head coach because he is Black. And so if you look at the history of NFL in terms of its hiring practices for coaches, they have been very hesitant about hiring, Black coaches, for instance. And so Eric Bieniemy would be an example. Another example would be talking about football still is this idea that for a long time the NFL was very resistant to the idea of even having a Black quarterback. The thought was for a long period of time was that the NFL offenses were too complex and that Black quarterbacks were not intelligent enough to run these offenses. Of course, that's ludicrous, right? But there was that sort of ideology in football for a long period of time. So this idea of race being an issue, at least when it comes to the NFL, has been an issue for quite a long time. And it seems to be still an issue when it comes to hiring at least the head football coach for an NFL franchise. So the last theory we'll talk about here is the meaning theory of media portrayal. And that's by DeFleur and Flax. And so it's basically asked the question of how media shapes the message and its impact on our social conduct. So going back to the idea of, we know these images are entertainment, we know they've been edited, yet they have an impact on how we conduct ourselves socially towards others, right, or with others. And so this idea that individuals, create, interpret, and retain a sense of meaning through the content, even if the content is make-believe, right? This idea that we retain a sense of meaning, even though the images that we know, again, are entertainment. And so meaning resides in people and is related to media content. And so essentially what DeFleur and Flax are saying, there's this link between audience and the media message. There is this link because, again, meaning resides in people and they relate it to the media content. So in other words, as we walk into a movie, we have certain expectations about how we expect to see certain races portrayed in media content, and we relate it to the media content. And so there's, again, this link between audience and the media message. And so they argue, or they hope, right, this idea that media content should be interpreted correctly by the audience. So again, media content should be interpreted correctly by the audience. And so this question here of how humans behave is a product of these inner understandings. So, and oftentimes these inner understandings are influenced by the media and how these individuals have seen various races or ethnicities depicted in the media. And so this human behavior, right, is a product of inner understandings. So the media provides meanings. So if you think about symbols, right, the symbols that we see on screen, the images that we see on screen, whether these images portray somebody in a positive light or in a negative light, and it also provides meaning for the events that we witness. For instance, the uprisings, right? The protests that happened last year regarding the murder of George Floyd, right? And so those sorts of things provide meanings. But the media and culture must give similar interpretations of symbols, images, and events. So does the media and does culture give similar interpretations of symbols, of the way people are represented, or events, or do they conflict? Right? I would say sometimes there's similar interpretations, and sometimes there are not similar interpretations. Sometimes they're vastly different, our interpretations that culture has about a group of folks and how media portrays these group of people. And so, right, media does have the ability to shape a message and establish a meaning, right, for a large number of people. And so, which again could be in sync with what culture says, or maybe different than what culture says. And so you need to think about these four things that media influences, right? So number one, it's the establishment, a new word or a new image. So think about the history of cinema, right? If you even think about a movie like, for instance, Birth of a Nation, for instance, yes, cinematically, just the way it was shot and edited and those sorts of things, great. But think about how it essentially created, a new stereotype, right, for African Americans. So this idea of establishment. Sometimes the establishment of a new meaning is not necessarily a good thing. And so an extension. So in other words, it expands the meaning. So it could be, the expansion again could be positive, or it could be a negative extension. Substitute. So it can change the meaning. In other words, right, if you portray a group of people in a positive light, sort of repetitively over and over again, eventually, right, it could change the meaning of how you define those group of people moving forward. So media has the power, again, to substitute or change the meaning of. And number four, stabilize. In other words, reinforce the meaning of a word or an image. So again, the four things that media influences, again, the establishment. So establishment does they have a new image, like a stereotype, a new word, either positive or negative, an extension of a meaning, so expand the meaning. Substitute, it could change the meaning. Or number four, it could stabilize, right? Or stabilization, reinforce the meaning of a word or an image through repetition. So let's think about this particular song. Some call it, the most powerful song against racism in the history of music, right? And so I guess the big question here about this one song is, does it have the ability to change, right, our interpretation of a group of people? Does it make us more empathetic when we hear this song?
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here's a strange and bitter
So again, right, the big question, I play this song because it's it's a critique of our society about its racism. And so does this one song or songs that critique our society about its racism, do they influence change in a significant way, right? If maybe yes, and maybe not, I don't know. It's for you to decide. So anyways, this concludes the lecture on the race section.